The weight of feathers. When people ask me how I became the man I am today, I tell them it began with a feather. Not metaphorically, but literally. A single white feather that drifted down from the gray November sky and landed on my sleeve as I stood outside the courthouse, divorce papers clutched in my trembling hand. I was 38 years old, freshly unemployed, newly homeless, and completely alone. My name is Nathan Foster, and on that cold morning in 2011, I believed my life was effectively over. The previous year had seen me lose everything. First, my job at the investment firm where I'd worked for 12 years, caught in the aftermath of a financial scandal I had no part in, but was blamed for nonetheless. Then my marriage, which had been crumbling for years, but finally collapsed under the weight of my depression and my wife's impatience with it. And finally, my home, the beautiful colonial in the Boston suburbs that had eaten most of my savings and was now in my ex-wife's possession. I stood there, staring at that feather, so delicate, so inconsequential, and felt a sudden, irrational rage. I brushed it away violently, watching it spiral to the wet pavement. "Careful there," said a voice beside me. That might have been important. I turned to see an older man, perhaps in his 70s, sitting on a nearby bench. He wore a worn peacoat and a woolen cap pulled low over silver hair. His eyes, though, were alert and warm beneath bushy eyebrows. "It's a feather," I snapped, immediately regretting my tone. "Yes," he agreed, unperturbed. "And everything carries weight, even feathers, especially feathers." I might have walked away then, dismissing him as just another eccentric old man. But something, perhaps the utter desolation of having nowhere else to be, no one waiting for me, made me take a seat beside him on the bench. "What does that even mean?" I asked, less hostile now, more weary. He smiled. "My name is Joseph Abernathy, and you look like a man who could use a cup of coffee and perhaps a different perspective." That chance encounter was the first thread in what would become the rich tapestry of my rebirth. Joseph, I would learn, had been a literature professor before retiring. He'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, and had since devoted himself to what he called bench philosophy, sitting in public places and engaging with whoever seemed in need of conversation. "Everyone has a story," he told me that day over steaming mugs in a nearby cafe. "Most people just need someone to listen to it." And so, I told him mine. The promising career cut short by others' greed, the marriage that had been more about convenience than love, the crushing debt from a house I no longer owned, the friends who had quietly disappeared when my status and resources had evaporated. Joseph listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finally fell silent, expecting platitudes or dismissal, he merely nodded. "That's a difficult story," he said. "But remember, it's just one chapter." "It feels like the final chapter," I replied. "Only if you stop writing." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook and pen, which he slid across the table to me. "Here, start the next one." I stared at the notebook. What am I supposed to write? "Whatever comes next," Joseph said simply. That evening I checked into a cheap motel with the few $100s I had left and opened the notebook. I stared at the blank page for nearly an hour before writing a single sentence. Today, I met Joseph. It seemed insignificant, but it was a beginning. The next morning I returned to the same bench, half hoping, half expecting to find Joseph there. He was, and with him was a copy of the local newspaper, open to the classified section. "I took the liberty," he said, circling an ad with a pen. "The community center needs someone to teach basic financial literacy. Given your background, I thought you might be qualified." "I was in investment banking," I said, confused. "Not education." "And now you're in transition," Joseph replied. "Perfect time to try something new." The position paid barely above minimum wage, but it was something. More importantly, it was a direction when I had none. I applied that afternoon, explaining honestly what had happened at my former firm while emphasizing my knowledge of personal finance. Whether it was desperation or Joseph's recommendation, I would later learn he volunteered there, teaching classic literature. They hired me on the spot. My first class was a disaster, facing a room of low-income adults who needed practical advice on budgeting and saving. I delved into market terminology and investment strategies far beyond their immediate needs. I watched their eyes glaze over, saw them exchange glances, felt the gulf widen between us. "That didn't go well," Joseph observed afterward, having slipped into the back of the classroom. "I don't know how to teach," I admitted. "I don't know how to talk to people who aren't like I was." "Then listen to them instead," he suggested. "Ask questions. Find out what they actually need, not what you think they should know." It was the first of many lessons Joseph would teach me about genuine service, about meeting people where they were, rather than where I thought they should be. The next class, I began by asking my students about their specific financial challenges. What emerged was a picture of lives constrained by predatory lending, insufficient income, and lack of basic financial knowledge. Their needs weren't theoretical. They were immediate and practical. I revamped my entire approach. Instead of talking about diversification and market trends, we discussed how to create emergency funds, negotiate with creditors, and avoid payday loan traps. For the first time since my downfall, I felt useful. The gratitude in my students' eyes when they understood a concept that could actually improve their circumstances gave me something I hadn't realized I'd lost: purpose. Each evening, I would write in the notebook Joseph had given me. What began as simple daily records evolved into reflections, then insights, and eventually a framework for rebuilding my life. Joseph and I continued to meet regularly, sometimes on the bench, sometimes at the cafe, occasionally at the small apartment I'd managed to rent after a few months of steady work. "You're making progress," he noted one evening, glancing around my sparse but dignified living space. "Thanks to you," I said. He shook his head. "I just pointed. You walked." Through Joseph, I met other members of what I came to think of as his bench collection, people whose lives he had touched simply by being present and attentive. There was Maria, a former chef who had lost her restaurant but now ran a successful food truck with Joseph's encouragement. There was Derek, once homeless, due to addiction, now 5 years sober and managing a shelter, and Eliza, a widow like Joseph, who had channeled her grief into creating community gardens throughout the city. What bound this unlikely group together was Joseph's gentle influence and the shared experience of having rebuilt lives from ruins. They became my first new friends, my support network, and eventually, my collaborators. 2 years after our first meeting, when the community center faced budget cuts that threatened to eliminate our financial literacy program, it was Maria who suggested we take it independent. "You've helped so many people, Nathan," she insisted. "Why limit it to the center?" And so, with their collective encouragement, I launched Second Chapter Financial, a nonprofit dedicated to providing financial education to those who needed it most. Derek offered space in the shelter for evening classes. Eliza connected me with community organizations. Joseph, ever the academic, helped design a curriculum that combined practical skills with empowering philosophy. We started small, just me teaching evening classes in borrowed spaces. But word spread. Former students referred friends and family. Local banks, seeing the value in financially educated customers, offered modest sponsorships. Within 18 months, I was able to hire 2 part-time instructors and expand to 5 locations across the city. It wasn't wealth, but it was sustainable. More importantly, it was meaningful in a way my former career had never been. I was using the same knowledge that had once helped the wealthy accumulate more wealth to instead help struggling individuals create stability and hope. Throughout this transformation, Joseph remained my mentor and closest friend. Our bench meetings continued, though less from necessity and more from mutual enjoyment. I noticed, however, that as the years passed, he seemed increasingly frail. His silver hair thinned, his sturdy frame became more stooped, his vibrant mind occasionally searched for words that once came easily. "Are you seeing a doctor regularly?" I finally asked one autumn day, concerned by his persistent cough. "Doctors can only tell you what you already know," he replied cryptically. I pressed him until he admitted he'd been diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis, a progressive, incurable lung disease. He'd known for years, even before we met. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, stunned by the revelation. "Would it have changed anything?" he countered. "Would you have valued our conversations more? Would my thoughts have carried greater weight?" "Of course not, but—" "Then it wasn't relevant to what we were building," he said simply. I insisted on accompanying him to his next doctor's appointment, where I learned the disease had progressed significantly. Joseph might have months, not years remaining. The news hit me with unexpected force. This man who had appeared in my life when I had nothing, who had shown me a path forward when I could see none, was preparing to exit it. "What can I do?" I asked him afterward, feeling helpless in the face of his mortality. Joseph considered the question carefully. "Continue," he said finally. "Not just the work, though that's important. Continue noticing the feathers." "The feathers?" "The small moments of beauty and chance that change everything if we let them," he explained. "The seemingly insignificant encounters that can alter the course of a life." Over the next several months, as Joseph's health declined, I found myself taking on his role in our community of second chances. I started spending time on benches in parks and outside courthouses. I carried extra copies of Joseph's small notebooks, ready to offer them to those who seemed lost. I listened more than I spoke, asked questions more than I offered solutions. And I began to understand what Joseph had known all along, that sometimes the most profound act of service is simply to witness another person's pain without trying to fix it, to acknowledge their struggle without diminishing it, to believe in their capacity for renewal before they can see it themselves. Joseph passed away peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning 5 years after we met. The bench collection, now grown to dozens of individuals whose lives he had touched, gathered for his memorial service. As I prepared to speak, I realized that collectively, we represented Joseph's true legacy, not buildings or fortunes, but reclaimed lives. "Joseph once told me that everything carries weight," I said to the assembled mourners. "Even feathers, especially feathers." I didn't understand then what he meant. I think I do now. I explained how that single white feather had led me to notice Joseph, how that moment of awareness had altered the trajectory of my life, how Joseph had done the same for others, creating moments of possibility through his presence and attention. "The weight of a feather is negligible," I continued, Scientifically, it's barely measurable. But the weight of the moment it creates, the shift in attention, the opening of possibility, that can be enough to tip the scales of a life from despair to hope, from isolation to connection, from ending to beginning. After the service, I returned to the bench where Joseph and I had first met. I sat there for hours, watching people pass, wondering whose life I might touch if I simply remained present and attentive. As evening approached and I prepared to leave, I noticed something on the bench beside me. A white feather, almost certainly blown there by the wind. Coincidence? Certainly. And yet, I carefully placed it in Joseph's notebook, which I now carried everywhere. The following week, I was sitting on that same bench when a young woman took a seat at the opposite end. She wore the shell-shocked expression I recognized from my own past, the look of someone whose world had recently imploded. After a few minutes of silence, I spoke. "Difficult day?" I asked. She glanced at me, suspicious at first. Then something in her seemed to relent. "Difficult year," she corrected. I nodded. "I've had a few of those myself." "Does it get better?" she asked, a question so vulnerable in its directness that it could only come from profound desperation. I considered my response carefully, honoring both her pain and her potential. "Not automatically," I said finally, "but it can, with time and help and purpose." She looked skeptical but didn't leave. "I don't even know where to start." I reached into my pocket and pulled out one of Joseph's notebooks. As I handed it to her, the feather slipped out, landing on her sleeve. "You could start there," I said, nodding at the feather. "Sometimes the smallest things carry the most significance." "It's just a feather," she said, echoing my own words from years earlier. I smiled. "That's what I thought too. My name is Nathan Foster, and you look like someone who could use a cup of coffee and perhaps a different perspective." Her name was Sophia Chen, a graphic designer who had lost her job, her apartment, and her confidence in rapid succession. Over coffee, she told me her story. Different in its details from mine, but similar in its themes of unexpected loss and uncertain future. I listened as Joseph had listened to me, offering no easy solutions but my complete attention. At the end of our conversation, I invited her to attend one of our financial workshops, scheduled for the following evening. "I don't think I'm ready to think about money yet," she admitted. "I'm still trying to process everything that's happened." "The workshop might help with that," I suggested. "But if you're not ready, maybe you'd be interested in something else. We're actually looking for someone to redesign our website and materials, given your background." I let the possibility hang in the air between us. 2 weeks later, Sophia began working with Second Chapter Financial as our media coordinator. Like me, she found unexpected healing in using her professional skills to serve others facing similar challenges. The feather from the bench became her first design element, subtle but present in all our materials, a reminder of how new beginnings often arrive in the most delicate of packages. Over the next 5 years, Second Chapter Financial grew, from a local nonprofit into a regional and then national organization. We developed partnerships with banks, credit unions, and community colleges. We created online courses and mobile apps that extended our reach beyond physical classrooms. Former students became instructors, carrying the message of financial empowerment back to their own communities. But the heart of our work remained the same, meeting people at their moment of greatest vulnerability and offering that not just financial education but restoration of dignity. Each person who came through our programs received one of Joseph's notebooks, though they didn't know that's what they were, and was encouraged to begin writing their next chapter. Today, second chapter. Financial operates in 37 states, serving over 50,000 individuals annually. Our headquarters in Boston houses not just our administrative offices, but also a cafe that employs program graduates and a community space available to local groups. The original bench where Joseph and I met has been relocated to our courtyard, along with a small plaque that reads simply, "Every feather has weight." My personal life, too, has found its balance. Sophia and I married 3 years after that bench encounter, our shared experience of loss and renewal creating a foundation stronger than either of us had known before. We have a daughter now, named Joy. A deliberate choice to honor what we've discovered is possible, even after profound despair. I still carry Joseph's original notebook, now filled to the final page. The last entry, written on the 10th anniversary of our meeting, reads, "Today, I became the feather." That's what I've learned through all of this, that we each have the capacity to be that seemingly insignificant thing that alters another's life course. It doesn't require wealth or special talent or extraordinary wisdom. It requires only presence, attention, and the willingness to acknowledge another's humanity when they've begun to doubt it themselves. Sometimes, in the darkest of nights, I still feel echoes of that desperate man standing outside the courthouse, believing his life was over. Then I remember how completely wrong he was, how that ending became the necessary precondition for a more meaningful beginning. And I'm reminded of Joseph's quiet insistence that only if I stopped writing would that chapter be final. So I continue to write, to teach, to listen, to sit on benches. I continue to notice feathers in all their forms, the small moments of connection that might, if we let them, change everything. Because now I understand what Joseph knew. The weight of a feather is immeasurable, not because it's so light, but because its potential impact is so profound. Every act of kindness, every moment of attention, every offered notebook carries within it the possibility of transformation. And in a world that often measures worth in material accumulation and status, perhaps that's the most important counter-message we can offer. That the things with the greatest power to change our lives often arrive with the least fanfare, like a feather drifting down from an ordinary gray sky, landing on the sleeve of someone who has forgotten how to hope. The only question is whether we'll brush it away or recognize its invitation to begin again. I'm grateful every day that Joseph helped me see the difference. For more real-life stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. New story every day.